The modern American flag has 13 stripes, representing the 13 original colonies which revolted against Great Britain and approved the 1776 Declaration of Independence, becoming the USA's first 13 states. But as important as those 13 colonies were, they weren't the only British colonies in North America, the modern US, or even the part of the US that originally revolted. Plus, there were plenty of colonies set up by other European powers. So what were these forgotten colonies, and how did they affect history? Let's explore. The 13 original colonies represented on the Declaration of Independence, going roughly south along the East Coast, are New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. These colonies in 1776 were the end results of colonial mergers and splits over the nearly 2 centuries between the first English settlements in the region and the American Revolution. We'll discuss the history of these 13 non-forgotten original colonies along with the forgotten English and non-English ones, so look at these on-screen counters if you get lost. The English were actually late to colonizing North America, even disregarding the Native Americans and the Norse. The first European settlement in what is now U.S. territory was Capara in Puerto Rico, founded by Spain in 1508. In the continental U.S., Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon tried to start a colony in Florida in 1521, but was repelled by the Calusan natives. In 1526, Spain tried again at San Miguel de Gualdape, which was somewhere in the Carolinas or Georgia, but that failed after a few months. The Spanish finally succeeded in 1565, with what would become St. Augustine, Florida, but by that time French Huguenot Protestants had already founded the nearby Fort Caroline, which the Spanish promptly attacked and destroyed. As for English and later British colonies, we can start like they did, in the south. In 1585, England tried to establish the Roanoke colony in what's now North Carolina. Organized from England by Sir Walter Raleigh, Roanoke famously didn't last, with over 100 colonists disappearing, leaving only the word Croatoan carved into the settlement's wall. England would gain a more permanent foothold in 1607, with the founding of Jamestown in Virginia by the Virginia Company, which very nearly failed as well, like 80 to 90% mortality by 1609 nearly failed. Jamestown was even briefly abandoned in 1610, but before the colonists even reached the Atlantic, they ran into their newly appointed governor, Lord Delaware, who had fresh supplies and orders to give it another shot. Jamestown would serve as the first capital of the colony of Virginia for nearly a century, before being abandoned in the 1700s as it was eclipsed by larger settlements. Virginia's economy, anchored by tobacco plantations worked by enslaved people, served as a template for colonies across the American South. Maryland was established just to the north of Virginia in 1632 as a haven for English Catholics by the second Lord Baltimore, holder of a barony in English-controlled Ireland. To Virginia's south, some wealthy Englishmen tried to set up a colony named Carolina after King Charles I, from 1629 to about 1640, but it never really got off the ground, at least not before the English Civil War began in 1642, which really threw a wrench into the whole colonialism thing. Instead, planters from Virginia slowly started branching southward, eventually justifying the creation of the province of Carolina in 1663, after the dust from the English Civil War had settled. Carolina was administered as 2 parts, Albemarle in the north and Clarendon in the south, which would become the separate colonies of North Carolina and South Carolina in 1712. For context, this was shortly after the 1707 Acts of Union, that combined the separate kingdoms of England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain, meaning all the English colonies became British colonies. The charter for Georgia was granted by King George II in 1732 to James Oglethorpe, with a few purposes: to host debtors from England, to serve as a buffer between the Carolinas and Spanish Florida to the south, and to test out a southern agricultural system that didn't rely on slavery. Slavery was even fully banned in the colony until 1751, when Oglethorpe and British Parliament bowed to pressure from Georgia's planters. Georgia was joined by 2 more colonies further south when the British won the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, in 1763. The British took over Spanish Florida as the colonies of East Florida and West Florida. The Floridas stayed loyal to Britain during the American Revolution, and were ceded back to Spain at that war's end. Florida would finally come under full control of the young United States with the 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty between the USA and Spain. The Spanish were England's main European rivals in the south, but in the Middle Colonies there was Dutch New Netherland, with its capital New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. The Swedish also started a colony, New Sweden, on the Delaware River in 1638, which the Dutch conquered in 1655. New Netherland was in turn conquered by the English in 1664, and ruled by the Duke of York as New York and New Jersey, with New Amsterdam becoming New York City. The Dutch briefly reoccupied New York City from August 1673 to February 1674. When England took it back in a peace treaty, they decided to split New Jersey into East Jersey and West Jersey, which would reunite in 1702, before informally splitting again into North and South Jersey with the 1856 invention of pork tailor ham roll. Pennsylvania was founded in 1681 by William Penn, though it's technically named after his father, Admiral Sir William Penn. Penn and his Quaker allies had previously bought the deeds to West and East Jersey, but Pennsylvania gave them a chance to start from scratch. The leaders of Pennsylvania didn't always practice the Quaker ideals of tolerance, but Pennsylvania was still generally more tolerant than the other colonies. The last of the Middle Colonies on the Declaration of Independence, Delaware, was never actually recognized by Britain as its own colony. Delaware had been disputed by Maryland and New Netherland. After the English conquered New Netherland, the Duke of York leased Delaware to William Penn, so Pennsylvania could have a seaport. In 1702, Pennsylvania granted the area its own government, calling it the 3 lower counties on the Delaware River, and in practice it acted as its own colony up through independence. While the Southern and Middle Colonies were pretty stable after the English took control, New England was kind of a hot mess, or perhaps a cold mess. Most Americans have heard of the Pilgrims, who landed at Plymouth in 1620 aboard the ship Mayflower. Plymouth wasn't the first colony in New England. That was St. Croix Island in Maine, which was settled in 1604 as part of French Acadia. Plymouth also wasn't the first English colony in New England. That was Popham Colony in 1607, also in Maine, founded by George Popham on behalf of a branch of the Virginia Company. The Popham colonists packed up and left in 1608, having made a decent profit with only a little starvation and disease, so Plymouth Colony was, at least, the first English colony in New England that actually lasted. The aforementioned Pilgrims were a religious sect that had separated from the Church of England and moved to the Netherlands. 37 of them came to Plymouth in modern Massachusetts, along with 65 other colonists that the Pilgrims called the Strangers. Plymouth got off to a rocky start, but became self-sustaining and inspired more New England colonies. The Wessagusset Colony, which followed in 1622, was disbanded after less than a year. The Dorchester Company's settlement in Cape Ann in 1623 disbanded after a few years too, with several residents re-establishing themselves in the future town of Salem, of witch trial infamy. The Mount Wollaston Colony followed in 1624, where a colonist named James Morton decided to lead an uprising among the colony's indentured servants, who took over and renamed the place the Merrymount Colony. Meanwhile, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded in 1628 by the Puritans, a religious sect that sought to purify the existing Church of England rather than break away from it. The colonists at Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay decided that Merrymount was a threat to their trade and/or religious interests, and arrested Morton in 1628 and sent him back to England. Morton returned in 1629, but in 1630 the other colonies burned Merrymount to the ground. The Puritans soon began kicking people out of their colonies, who would go and found their own colonies. This happened in 1636 to Roger Williams, who founded Providence Plantations, and to Thomas Hooker, who founded the Connecticut River Colony. Roger Williams soon found himself with neighbors in the form of Portsmouth, Newport, and Warwick, which were also founded by people kicked out of Massachusetts. These 4 would later merge into the colony and later state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, which was soon renamed to just Rhode Island, and by soon I mean in 2020 by a state ballot measure. Thomas Hooker got his own neighbors, a group of Puritan nobles in the Saybrook Colony, and the New Haven Colony, a commercial venture that lacked an official colonial charter. Saybrook merged into Connecticut in 1644, as did New Haven in 1664. To the north of Massachusetts, Scotsman David Thompson set up a fishing village in 1623, which would later become part of the province of New Hampshire. English military officer Sir Ferdinando Gorges sponsored the settlement of modern Maine, with the province of Ligonia and New Somersetshire, which would later become the province of Maine. England briefly tried to merge the colonies from the New Jerseys through Maine into a more centralized Dominion of New England. The Dominion was established in 1685 by James II, but soon events in England once again shook things up in America. In 1688, the Protestant co-monarchs William and Mary took over the throne from Catholic James II in the Glorious Revolution. When the Puritans in Boston heard about this in April 1689, they seized the opportunity to depose the Dominion's governor, Edmund Andros, and soon the Dominion of New England split back into its components, with Massachusetts retaining control of Maine, as well as Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, which had been part of New York. New England's final states would settle out after the independent Vermont Republic joined the USA in 1791, and Maine resplit from Massachusetts as part of the 1820 Missouri Compromise. Beyond the East Coast, there were plenty more colonial entities in the current US, including several British colonies that would eventually be split between the US and Canada, Spanish colonies in the American Southwest, French Louisiana, and Russian Alaska. If you count the US as island territories, you get some weird ones, like the Northern Mariana Islands, which were controlled by Spain, Germany, and Japan, a Scottish claim on an island in Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands, which were controlled at times by Spain, France, England, the Netherlands, Denmark, Brandenburg Prussia, and the Knights of Malta. So, while they may be less famous, these forgotten colonies still left a legacy on America today. These range from the names and borders of counties and cities within states, to imprints on modern American culture, to historic sites for researchers and tourists to examine and learn from. And while they may not have lasted long enough to join the 13 original states, they're still all an important part of the history and landscape of the United States of America. Be sure to leave your feedback in the comments, and subscribe if you want to see more like this. And as always, thanks for watching.